meek shall not inherit the earth. They wouldn't know what to do with it.
Welcome to episode 36 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we're exploring corrosive father-daughter relationships, pairing two films that ask how far one would go in the name of scientific discovery, even when it threatens the well-being of those we hold closest. First up, we have Eyes Without a Face, which was released in 1960. This was directed by Georges Franju and stars Pierre Brasseur, Edith Scob, and Alida Valli. Then we jump forward a decade to 1971 for Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, Hammer's attempt to breathe new life into the horror trope of the mummy film. This was directed, in part, by Seth Holt and stars Valerie Leon, Andrew Keir, James Villers, and Mark Edwards. Along the way, we'll be exploring the career of Georges Franju, the birth of the Cinémathèque Française, the forefather of modern cinema special effects, Georges Méliès, the life and works of Bram Stoker, the literary and historical origins of the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs, and much, much more. Before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will, as usual, be listed or linked in the show notes. When discussing Eyes Without a Face, I have referenced the documentary The Evil Flowers of Georges Franju, which is available on the 4K special edition from Umbrella Entertainment. I have also referred to interviews and articles on the websites cinemathèque.fr, depaissant.fr, and deepfocusreview.com. I've also referenced the book Euro-Gothic, Classics of Continental Horror Cinema by Jonathan Rigby. And when discussing Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, I have referenced the novel The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker, and this was the complete edition published by Seven Treasures Publications. I've also referred to the book Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film by Peter Hutchings, Little Shop of Horrors magazine, issue 24, and the Blood from the Mummy's Tomb featurette from the Studio Canal Blu-ray release. I've also referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb pages for all of the films discussed, as well as the directors, authors, cast and crew. All of which brings us on to the first of this week's films, which is Eyes Without a Face from 1960. As mentioned, this was directed by Georges Franju and stars Pierre Brasseur, Edith Scob and Alida Valli. As regular listeners will know, usually in these episodes I give a summary and a critique of the movie, followed by a snapshot of the critical reception of the time. But this week I thought I'd mix things up a little bit and read you just one of the reviews that was published at the time of the film's release in the UK in 1960. This comes courtesy of Jonathan Rigby's book Euro-Gothic, Classics of Continental Horror Cinema, and is a review taken from that guardian of good taste, the Daily Mail. Quote, Eyes Without a Face is a piece of revolting, pandering, evil rubbish. I wonder what the censor was up to the day he gave this film an X certificate. He should have ordered it to be publicly burnt in the Charing Cross Road, and on top of the fire, he should have thrown the makers of the film and the people who saw fit to release it in Britain. End quote. Well, what do you know? The Daily Mail didn't like it. To be fair to the Daily Mail, now that's a sentence I never thought I'd hear myself say, they weren't the only publication with objections. The magazine The Spectator, which is almost as right-wing, but possibly not quite as rabid as the Daily Mail, called it the sickest film since I started film criticism. And according to Wikipedia, a writer on the magazine who expressed an admiration for the movie lost their job as a result. So perhaps they were equally as rabid as the Daily Mail after all. Meanwhile, the English Monthly Film Bulletin simply called it inept and said that actors Pierre Brasseur and Alida Valli were wasted, even though they, quote, did what they can with almost non-existent characters, end quote. As you can tell then, on its original British release, the knives, or should that be scalpels, were well and truly out. It was really only when the film was re-released in 1986 that it was reappraised and re-evaluated by the mainstream critics. But those in the horror community, whether filmmaker or spectator, had already beaten the mainstream to the punch. John Carpenter has said that the mask worn by Michael Myers in Halloween was partly influenced by the blank face mask worn by Edith Scob, while subsequent directors have also cited the film as an influence on their work. Guillermo del Toro has named it one of his favourite films of all time. Pedro Almodóvar has conceded that it was a reference for his movie, The Skin I Live in 2011, and the DNA of the film is also very much present in the 2014 movie Goodnight Mommy, from directing duo Veronica Franz and Severin Fiala. But even before this, the plot of the film certainly acted as inspiration for the first ever Spanish horror movie, Gritos en la Noche, also known as The Awful Dr. Orloff. This was directed by Jess Franco and released in 1962, and we mentioned it rather briefly all the way back in episode 1. It was also the inspiration for the fairly dreadful British potboiler Corruption, which was released in 1968 and stars Peter Cushing and Sue Lloyd. The influence is also present in the 1977 movie Scalpel, which was also released as False Face, and as one of the earliest body horror films concerning the restoration of beauty, we can also see a very slight trickle down to movies like The Substance, starring Demi Moore, which was released in 2024. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you haven't seen Eyes Without a Face, it's time to hit the pause button. The story tells of a young girl, Christiane, played by Edith Scob, who has been badly disfigured in a car accident and is presumed missing. In reality, though, she is in hiding in the countryside chateau of her father, Dr. Genessier, who is played by Pierre Brasseur. Dr. Genessier is a brilliant surgeon who works from a clinic in the grounds of his chateau and who also keeps a pack of stray dogs locked in cages in the cellar of his home. Aided by his assistant Louise, played by Euro horror favourite Alida Valli, he is attempting to restore his daughter's face through a series of full face transplants that are motivated by guilt as much as they are scientific progress. Genessier was driving the car on the night of the accident and is determined to go to any lengths to atone for his sins, including the kidnap and drugging of young women whose faces he removes to transplant onto his daughter's burned visage. The film was derived from a novel of the same name written by Jean Redon and which was published in France after the release of the film. This publication was part of a series of books titled Angoisse, a word that means anguish in English, but which can also be read as anxiety, dread, or fear. Much like the Giallo in Italy, this paperback line specialised in crime and psychological thrillers, but unlike the Giallo, also included horror stories, a genre in which Redon's novel would certainly have felt at home. The novel was optioned for film by a producer called Jules Burcon and his company Champs-Élysées Productions. Inspired by the international success of Hammer Studios, Bourcon saw a gap in the market and purchased the film rights as a financial opportunity. France at the time was decades away from the new French extremity movement of the early 2000s, and cinema fantastique, as horror was then categorized, was seen as a minor and unimportant genre, the antithesis of the good taste that critics believed to be a hallmark of French cinema at the time. The idea for the story was then presented to the actor Pierre Brasseur, who, at the time, was working on a film called Head Against the Wall with the director Georges Franju. Georges Franju is an incredibly important figure in French cinema and one of the founders of the Cinémathèque Française, a non-profit film organisation that exists to this day and is one of the most important film archives in the world. That being said, Franju's career did not begin in cinema, and he held various jobs before he found the career for which he is now best known. Born in Fougères, France in 1912, he nurtured an eclectic reading habit from a very young age, and after a rather undistinguished school career, dabbled with various professions, including as a clerk in an insurance company and also a job in a factory that manufactured noodles. After briefly serving in the military in Algeria, he was discharged in 1932, at which point he studied to become a set designer and later created theatrical backdrops for music halls, including the Folies Bergère. In 1934, he met a man called Henri Langlois, and the two created a short 16mm film titled Les Métros. They also started a short-lived film magazine and a film club called Les Cercles du Cinéma. This was established with 500 francs that were borrowed from Langlois' parents, and showed silent films from their own collections, followed by discussion about the film from club members. In 1935, the two met Georges Méliès, the man who is considered the inventor of film special effects, with his innovative silent shorts, in particular A Trip to the Moon that was made in 1902, and The Impossible Voyage, which was made in 1904. Both Langlois and Franju were huge admirers of Méliès, who by this time was living in a retirement home for filmmakers in Orly after spending years in poverty. In 1936, Franju and Langlois rented an abandoned building on the property to store their collection of film prints and trusted the key to the building to Méliès, who essentially became the first caretaker of what would become the Cinémathèque Française. Also here, the three, along with two other young filmmakers, began work on a project titled The Phantom of the Metro, though sadly it would not come to fruition. As mentioned, the Cinémathèque Française continues to this day, though Franju withdrew from the organisation in 1938 and would only really return again in the 1970s. Instead, in 1940, he co-founded another organisation, the Film Circuit of Arts and Sciences, with a co-worker called Dominique Johansson, who he would later go on to marry. In 1949, he began working on a series of documentary shorts, though the term documentary is almost a misnomer, as his films are shot in a visual style that is somewhat influenced by the Surrealist movement. His first film, The Blood of the Beasts, was released in 1949 and quickly established his reputation as a provocateur, with audience members reportedly passing out in the cinema, which is hardly surprising perhaps given the subject. This 22-minute film focuses on a Paris slaughterhouse that specialises in the production of horse meat and is by all accounts shot in an unflinching but poetic style that he would replicate in Eyes Without a Face. It's available to watch on YouTube, but I'm going to be completely honest, I only made it through the first 4 minutes before deciding to switch it off. This wasn't due to the quality of the filmmaking, which even in the first few minutes is remarkable, but because I really had no desire to watch the subject matter, regardless of how short or artistic the experience. According to actress Edith Scob, who would in many ways become Franju's muse, it was, quote, seeing the abattoirs and sensing the violence that made him want to make films. He didn't want to make films just for the sake of it. There were certain subjects that moved him and made him want to make films. End quote. What I can tell you about the film then is restricted to those first few moments, but it is very clear, even from these short sequences, that Franju was attempting something far more than what we would consider a usual documentary. Beginning on Wasteland, on the outskirts of Paris, he presents a series of intriguingly shot images that are juxtaposed with the surrounding landscape. An armless mannequin posed against the sky, which anticipates the blank mask worn in Eyes Without a Face, a framed photograph standing amid the earth, and a man sitting at a table, seemingly transferred from a dining room to sit in the middle of nowhere. Viewers who have a much stronger constitution than I do report that between the unflinching depiction of death in the slaughterhouse, Franju contrasts the harsh brutality with scenes of the local landscape, and, as with the image of the dining table, places objects in unusual contexts, so that, in his own words, quote, the object rediscovers its quality as an object. End quote. Much of this seems to stem from a childhood memory where his parents were moving, and a chair and a mirror were left sitting in the street, out of place, and as a result, suddenly unusual. Despite this, Franju is not so much a surrealist, but perhaps more of a fantasy realist. While he has certainly said that he learned much from the surrealist movement, what he depicts in his films is the extraordinary found in everyday life, much as if you stare at an everyday object for too long and are suddenly struck by its bizarre shape and structure. He creates a world in which the unusual is adjacent to the everyday. The Blood of the Beast was a sensation and also a scandal, but it also attracted the attention of Jean Cocteau, who leapt to the film's defence against the most vocal of critics, and the two would subsequently become good friends. He followed this with a series of other documentaries that were equally as controversial, or at the very least, controversial to the people who commissioned them. These include his second documentary, which was commissioned by the government in 1950 and was titled Passing by the Lorraine. This was supposed to be a celebration of the modernisation of French industry following World War II. However, the director delivered a visual critique of the ugliness caused by industrialisation, as opposed to championing progress. Despite this, though, the government commissioned a second film, this time titled The Hotel of Invalids, which was supposedly meant to be a tribute to life inside a veterans' hospital, but which Franju turned into a critique against the glorification of the military. In 1952, he also made a short film titled Le Grand Méliès about the filmmaker Georges Méliès, who by this stage had died, having passed away from cancer in 1938. Both Franju and Langlois had visited Méliès shortly before his death, where he showed them one of his last drawings of a champagne bottle with a cork popping out. It is reported that he told them, quote, "Laugh, my friends. Laugh with me. Laugh for me, because I dream for you." End quote. I am unlikely to have another opportunity to discuss Langlois in this series, so I just wanted to swerve ever so slightly and discuss his activities during the Nazi occupation of Paris. During this time, he held secret screenings in his parents' living room, projecting movies banned by the Germans. His film archiving work, which had begun as a teenager, also accelerated as he and his friends smuggled films out of Paris to save them from being destroyed by the fascist censors. As we discussed back in episode 1, Art and cinema are frequently seen by dictatorships as subversive, and without Langlois and his friends, many of these works would have been lost forever. Following several more documentaries, in 1958 Franju was invited to direct his first full-length feature, titled Head Against the Wall, joining the film when it was already in pre-production. This is a drama following an aimless young man who is institutionalized for defying his wealthy father, and which was also a critique of attitudes towards mental illness. The film was praised by the critics of the magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, which included in its writers François Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, and Jean-Luc Godard. Godard, in particular, was very impressed by the film, writing that the director portrayed, quote, the madness behind reality, because it is for him the only way to discover the true face of reality behind the madness. End quote. It was when working on this film that he first met the actress Edith Scob, being so taken with her beauty in a photograph supplied by casting that he created a very small part specifically for her. She appears in the film momentarily as a girl singing in a church, and it would mark the beginning of their working relationship. It was also here that he first worked with the actor Pierre Brasseur, who told him the basis of the story that would become Eyes Without a Face. According to Brasseur, in an interview published by the Cinémathèque, he described the plot of the source novel as, quote, I'm a paranoid, alcoholic plastic surgeon who, while driving drunk, has a car accident. My car catches fire, and my daughter, who is with me, is very badly burned. Since she is disfigured, I try to reconstruct her face by performing a heterograft. The experiment, of course, fails, but because I'm insanely vain, I repeat my attempts. My assistant is my supplier. He's a dangerous neurotic, a maniac. He grows roses in his laboratory. He's also a morphine addict. He provides me with subjects, with raw materials, meaning he abducts young girls and brings them to my operating table. Since my procedures are lethal, the assistant disposes of the bodies. He buries them after raping them, and the story ends with my arrest. As I was about to perform another transplant, police officers burst into the operating room. They handcuff me, and my daughter, who is watching from the gallery overlooking the scene, throws herself into the void and crashes onto the paving stones at my feet, where she dies in a pool of blood. End quote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the synopsis, Brasseur said that the darkness of his character and the excessiveness of the required special effects made him rather hesitant, while Franju described the story as, quote-unquote, too dumb for words. Regardless, he was interested and arranged a meeting with the producer, Jules Bourcon. The two hit it off immediately, and it was decided that Franju would direct the film, albeit with major changes to the original narrative. While the producer Bourcon wanted a powerful horror, he also wanted to avoid any issues with the censors, with distributors, or the Catholic Film Commission, so he provided a set of rigid restrictions. With an eye on international sales, he stipulated, quote, I didn't want dogs tortured by the scalpel because of the English, who respect animals. Not too much blood for fear of an age restriction, and no crazy doctors because of German censorship. It would just bring back bad memories for them. End quote. In addition, to give the film an international appeal, an international cast was required, which explains the inclusion of Alida Valli from Italy and German actress Juliette Manuel as Edna Gruber, the focus of the film's most notorious scene. In the same interview with Cinémathèque France, Franju said that rather than seeing the restrictions as a problem, they provided stimulus, and that the barriers erected by Balkan served to give him ideas. The first idea concerned the character of Dr. Genessier, who Franju wanted to portray not as a typical horror doctor like Dr. Jekyll or Dr. Caligari, but instead an ordinary man. He went on to say, quote, "If an abnormal character behaves abnormally, then it's normal. Whereas if an apparently normal man behaves abnormally, then it's abnormal and disturbing. In the first case, our character belongs to classic fantasy, and in the second, to the unusual. Only the latter attracts me because I fear it, and I fear it because I believe in it." End quote. Even if Dr. Genessier commits monstrous acts, he is far from being a monster, as we see in his compassion towards the young boy in his care later in the film. Unlike the mad scientists or psychopaths that are so common in horror, Genessier is fully aware of the nature of his crimes, reflecting, "I've done so much wrong to perform this miracle." But despite this awareness, he persists anyway. Although his actions do raise the moral question of how far one might go for one's children, it should also be remembered that love or guilt are not his sole motivations. Much like the father figure that we will discuss later from Bram Stoker's novel The Jewel of Seven Stars, Genessier is also motivated by science and medical arrogance, as is clear from his declaration, quote, "If this were a success, God, you couldn't put a price on it." End quote. To help with the adaptation, Franju suggested the writing duo of Pierre Boileau and Pierre Hérault, who wrote together under the pseudonym Boileau-Narcejac, and whose works had already been adapted into film with Les Diaboliques in 1955 and Hitchcock's Vertigo in 1958. As you can tell by comparing the original story synopsis and the finished film, a significant number of changes were made to the narrative, as well as the shift in the Doctor's character from quote-unquote insanely vain. The male assistant was made female and became Louise, who feels compelled to help with the crimes out of a loyalty to the Doctor and also a love for his daughter. More importantly, the focus of the story shifts away from Dr. Genessier and onto his daughter, Christiane. For Franju, there was only one person he wanted for the role, and that was, of course, Edith Scob. Her performance is undeniably impressive, all the more so because this was her first real movie, following her minor appearance in Head Against the Wall, and also because for the most part she is wearing her mask, requiring all of her emotion to be conveyed through her body language and incredibly expressive eyes. Despite these restrictions, we feel every emotion as she wanders the house, a performance helped in no small part by maintaining the mask in between takes. Dressed like that, she has said, she was physically immersed in a dark place and atmosphere, a place of isolation that made communication with her co-stars challenging, forcing her to express herself through movement and gestures that she says were sometimes unconscious and sometimes stylized. Christiane is a figure of tragedy, trapped in her father's chateau like a fairy tale character, an analogy emphasized by the long series of shots that follow the Doctor through the house and up a series of stairs to her bedroom, a moment that for me was reminiscent of the story of Rapunzel. Although she has conversations with both her father and Louise, it becomes clear that her only real friends are the doves in the cage and the dogs in the cellar, animals whose trapped existence mirrors her own, and which she sets free at the climax of the film. While her father believes he is restoring her life, he has trapped her in an isolated existence, and, as we discover, even if her operation is a success, she will be forced to adopt a new life, a new name, and move away from everything that she knows. This tragedy is underlined by the musical theme that accompanies her, one of the very spare uses of music in the film. This is a melancholy refrain composed by Maurice Jarre and suggests innocence, fragility, and childhood, and is reminiscent of a musical box containing a ballerina figure that is forever trapped in the same dance. The character of Louise, played by Alida Valli, is as equally complex as Genessier, and despite the truly appalling nature of her crimes, she is far more than being a two-dimensional villain. We learn that she too was a patient of the Doctor, and that her complicity, in part, comes from her gratitude. More than this, though, there is a sense that she is also motivated by a love for both the Doctor and Christiane, with the three becoming almost a perverse family unit. It is also quite clear that she takes no pleasure in her actions, breaking down shortly after the fake funeral that they hold for Christiane, and also during the disposal of Edna's body. In her own way, she is just as trapped as Genessier's daughter. The whirling carnival music that acts as her theme tune, suggesting not pleasure or happiness, but an endless merry-go-round of chaos, in which she has become enmeshed. Much like the Doctor, the humanity of her character makes her all the more terrifying, alternating between the incredibly uncomfortable stalking of Edna and compassion for her victim once the procedure is complete. As already mentioned, the horrors in this film are not to be found in figures of the extreme, but rather in the terrible acts committed by seemingly ordinary people, each with their own motivations that, for them at least, justify the crimes that they commit. Her final moments, as she is stabbed in the neck with a scalpel, are certainly not those of a classic movie villain, but more of a woman betrayed by a daughter figure that she loved. As in his documentary work, the film is a combination of the ordinary and the strange, with the sparse use of music making acts of horror seem commonplace. When Edna is drugged and carried through the house to the laboratory, there is no typical orchestral sting or cliched horror orchestration, but instead a lengthy sequence that simply depicts the quote-unquote normality of the actions, shifted slightly off-kilter by the blank-faced Christiane slowly following behind. Although the film is shocking, there are no real sudden shocks, just a heavy sense of inevitability and dread, emphasizing Franju's belief that horror lies in the everyday. This is also apparent in the film's most notorious scene, the 6-minute unflinching surgical removal of Edna's face, which was based on real surgical footage. This was from a technical film about brain surgery, conducted while the patient was still fully conscious. In Eyes Without a Face, the surgery is depicted as it would occur in reality, and there were in fact medical experts on hand to ensure accuracy in everything that we see. And although the ultimate removal of Edna's face is certainly what made audiences faint at the premieres, for me it is the marking of the pencil lines and the first incisions of the scalpel that create the most discomfort, the anticipation of what is about to come, almost worse than the final moments. This documentary style is also evident in the use of still photographs that depict Christiane's slowly ravaged face as her transplant is rejected. Accompanied by the doctor's voiceover, they seem almost more appropriate for a medical evaluation in a technical training film than they do for a horror movie. This is not to suggest, though, that the film is in any way flat or lacking in poetry. As already mentioned, Franju was accomplished in blending the two to an incredibly disorientating effect. A director with an obsessive attention to detail, his scripts were written with the dialogue on one page and a detailed documentation of every shot on the opposite, a methodology that Edith Scob described in the interview with Cinémathèque Française. Quote, "Franju was so consumed by his shots, so invested, that I was always drawn into his world, infected with great intensity. The filming itself had something magical about it, with its consistently beautiful, fantastical lighting, thanks to the talent of Schuftan, the cinematographer." End quote. Eugène Schuftan had worked in silent German cinema on some of the very films Henri Langlois had smuggled out of Paris from the Nazis, and the cinematographer was chosen for this very reason. His work, guided by Franju's meticulous instructions, focuses on depth of field and light and shadow, particularly in the nighttime scenes featuring the disposal of the bodies, which are incredibly beautifully lit. There is also a wonderful use of a zoom as a train hurtles past a railway crossing on its way to Paris, suggesting a crossing of boundaries between safety and danger, as Louise drives Edna to the chateau. And the final moments are, of course, pure poetry, as Christiane releases first the dogs and then the doves before wandering into the night. This is, in my opinion, a far more fitting end for the character than that of the original source novel, which instead serves as the inspiration for Edna's final demise. This being a Franju film, though, he of course conflates the poetry of this sequence with the violence of Genessier's ultimate fate, savaged by the dogs that he has kept captive and his face torn asunder, an ending that is both metaphorical and karmic given his preceding actions. Before its official premiere in March 1960, the film was previewed in 1959 at a film club in Paris and at the Edinburgh Film Festival, resulting in several spectators passing out on both occasions, which was certainly a taste of what was to come. Much of the subsequent criticism also seems to have stemmed from Franju's reputation as a figure in French cinema, and is remarkably similar, in fact, to the critiques directed towards director Claire Denis when she premiered her film Trouble Every Day in 2001. As we know now, and as is so often the case, the film is quite rightly regarded as a classic and of significant influence. So it's probably fair to say that, as with much of his work, Franju was simply ahead of both his time and also audience sensibilities. Following the release of Eyes Without a Face, Franju directed the thriller Spotlight on a Murderer, again starring Pierre Brasseur and scored by Maurice Jarre, and then the drama Thérèse d'Esquerou, starring Emmanuel Riva, Philippe Noiret and Edith Scob. In 1963, he worked with Scob once again for the neo-noir crime movie Judex, and then once again for his 1965 feature Thomas the Imposter. In later years, his filmmaking became more infrequent, and after occasionally directing for television, he retired from filmmaking to preside over the Cinémathèque Française. He died on the 5th of November 1987 in Paris at the age of 75. Edith Scob continued her acting career and appeared in over 100 films and TV programmes. In 2012, she starred in the film Holy Motors, a fantasy drama directed by Leo Carax, and in which she wore, rather briefly, a mask that deliberately recalled her role as Christiane. She died in Paris, aged 81, on the 26th of June 2019. Pierre Brasseur, whose film career began in 1925, made over 150 screen appearances in both film and television. Perhaps best remembered for the films Port of Shadows in 1938, Les Enfants du Paradis in 1949, and of course, Eyes Without a Face. His final film was released posthumously and was titled The Most Wonderful Evening of My Life. He died of a heart attack in the middle of filming this movie in Italy on the 14th of August 1972. He was 66 years old. All of which brings us on to our second Father of the Week, and yes, the hint of sarcasm is completely intentional. This is Blood from the Mummy's Tomb from 1971, which was directed in the main by Seth Holt, and stars Valerie Leon, Andrew Keir, James Villers, and Mark Edwards. The beginning of the 1970s marked a period where the Gothic horrors of Hammer's heyday dramatically fell out of favour. The erotic violence that had so shocked audiences in 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein and 1958's Dracula paled into insignificance when compared with the likes of Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead, both released in 1968, and both of which marked a considerable shift in audience taste and expectations. In Europe, the explosion of the Italian giallo, ushered in by Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970, also heralded a change in style, while in Britain itself, films like Michael Reeves' 1967 film The Sorcerers and 1968's Witchfinder General were also taking great leaps forward, both in their depictions of violence and also social commentary. By the turn of the new decade, then, the traditional Gothic horrors of the previous 13 years were beginning to look rather tired. And, as writer Kim Newman wrote in his book Nightmare Movies, quote, English Gothic cinema was fatally wounded by the bullet in Dwayne Jones' head, but its death throes were protracted. End quote. Funding from US distributors like MGM, Paramount, and Seven Arts Productions started to be withdrawn, and with ticket sales also on decline, it's fair to say that the House of Hammer was standing on decidedly shaky ground. By this stage, the studio had all but wrung the last drops of blood from their key franchises of Dracula and Frankenstein, with increasingly diminishing returns. Scars of Dracula, released in 1970, was widely criticised as routine repetition, padded out with moments of sadism, and Horror of Frankenstein, released the same year, was just as poorly received. To fight this, the studio began to experiment with new producers, new writers, and new ideas, some of which were far more successful than others. The Vampire Lovers, released in 1970, tempted cinema goers with same-sex titillation, and was very successful. But with the release of the execrable follow-up, Lust for a Vampire, in 1971, it appeared that the studio had all but given up on the horrors and was instead resorting more to female nudity. By the time we get to Dracula, AD 1972, and its follow-up 1973's The Satanic Rites of Dracula, the collapse was almost complete. But this is not to suggest that all of their output at the start of the decade was a complete failure. In 1971, the same year that, in my opinion, they hit a real low with Lust for a Vampire, they also released a handful of films that, while far from being perfect, had a fair amount going for them in terms of story, direction, and attempts to explore new territory. Twins of Evil, the third in their Karnstein trilogy, is a huge step up from its two predecessors, and movies like Hands of the Ripper and Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde were at least trying to do something new with their narratives, even if they weren't entirely successful. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, also released in 1971, fits very much into this category. It's far from being perfect, and certainly has its fair share of issues, but for me it represents a landmark in the middle of an ocean of far less satisfying pictures. The idea for the film came from a man called Howard Brandy, an American press agent living in London who wanted to move into film production. He presented the idea to the head of the studio, James Carreras, with an elevator pitch which went something along the lines of, imagine a mummy film where instead of a man wrapped in bandages, you have a beautiful half-naked woman. With that in mind, you could be forgiven for assuming that the film was going to be still more titillation. And while I'm sure that a semi-naked Valerie Leon was, and probably still is, a major draw for male viewers, the film has far more going for it than that. With references to Nietzschean philosophy, ancient evil, parental dynamics, and allusions to necrophilia and incest, the themes it attempts to explore are highly intriguing, even if it doesn't seem to know exactly what to do with them by the end. Much of this stems from the choice of source material, the novel The Jewel of Seven Stars, which was first published in 1903 by the Irish writer Bram Stoker, best known as the author of Dracula, which was itself first published in 1897. And although the novel lives very much in the shadow of its literary predecessor, the Jewel of Seven Stars has in fact now been committed to film 4 times. As well as this one, there is a TV version, The Curse of the Mummy, which was screened in 1970. There's The Awakening, starring Charlton Heston, Stephanie Zimbalist and Susanna York, which was released in 1980, and Bram Stoker's Legend of the Mummy, a direct-to-video effort released in 1997, and which stars Lou Gossett Jr. and Amy Locane. And to be completely fair to Hammer, having watched all of the others in preparation for this episode, I think it's fair to say that this one is the best version, even if it does take certain liberties with the plot. As of the time of recording, all of the others are available to watch for free on YouTube, though they are an incredibly mixed bag, so I would certainly advise proceeding with caution. Bram Stoker was born Abraham Stoker in Dublin, Ireland in 1847. He spent much of his childhood bedridden with an undiagnosed illness and was homeschooled before enrolling at Trinity School, Dublin in 1864. He excelled at rugby and became an active member of the student union. He was also president of the Philosophical Society and auditor of the Historical Society, remaining to this day the only person to ever hold both positions. Whilst here, he also became friends with a fellow student, Willie Wilde, the older brother of Oscar Wilde. Their friendship led to Stoker visiting the Wilde family home, where Willie and Oscar's father, the Egyptology enthusiast Sir William Wilde, often shared stories of his expeditions. And this is something that will become more important later. Stoker nominated Oscar for membership of the Philosophical Society, but their relationship would suffer a rift just a few years later, when Stoker married Oscar's first love, a woman called Florence Balcombe, more of which shortly. On graduating, Bram Stoker joined the civil service and also became the theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, a publication that was co-owned by Sheridan Le Fanu, who coincidentally enough was the author of the short story Carmilla. This is widely regarded as a foundational work of vampire literature, and it also became the basis for Hammer's Karnstein trilogy, amongst numerous other film adaptations. At this time, theatre critics were held in relatively low esteem. No comment, but Stoker soon drew attention for the quality of his writing. One of those whose attention was drawn was the actor Henry Irving, who invited Stoker to join him for dinner following a favourable review of his production of Hamlet at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. The two soon became friends, and it is a widely held belief that Irving served as the inspiration for Stoker's fictional Count, with the description of Dracula apparently bearing a remarkable similarity to the face, mannerisms, and presence of the actor. During his time as a theatre critic, he also began writing fiction, including the story The Crystal Cup, which was published by the London Society in 1872, and his first novel, The Primrose Path, published in 5 instalments in a magazine called The Shamrock. He also wrote a non-fiction book titled The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland, which was published in 1879. A year prior, in 1878, he married Florence Balcombe, a move which, by all accounts, upset Oscar Wilde greatly, though Willie and Bram remained friends. Once married, the couple moved to London, where Stoker became the acting manager and then business manager of Henry Irving's Lyceum Theatre in the West End, and this was a position that he held for 27 years. This role allowed Stoker entry into London society, where he met and befriended the artist James Whistler and the writer Arthur Conan Doyle. Even though working for Henry Irving kept him busy, to say the least, he found time to continue his writing. In 1881, he published a collection of short stories with the title Under the Sunset, and his first novel, The Snake's Pass, was published in 1890. This was inspired by the legend of St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, but it wasn't particularly well received. He followed this with a novella, The Waters of Mull, in 1895, and the romance novel The Shoulder of Shasta, also published in 1895. And then 2 years later, he published the work for which he is best known, which is, of course, Dracula. While some modern analysts cite that the novel had a mixed reception on its release, overall it seems to have been very well received and was favourably compared to other writers, including Edgar Allan Poe, the Bronte sisters, and, I guess no surprise here, Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. The Daily Telegraph called it the best vampire story ever written, but others criticised it for being too horrific and thought that the horror was far too overt when compared with other works like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Nevertheless, his friend Arthur Conan Doyle was so impressed with the novel that he wrote a letter to Stoker stating, quote, "I congratulate you with all of my heart for having written so fine a book." End quote. Unfortunately, despite its critical success and huge popularity, Dracula failed to earn him very much money. In fact, for the first 1,000 sales, he earned no royalties at all. And sadly, despite its place in history and the significant influence that continues to this day, it didn't really bring him the success that he so truly deserved. He followed this in 1898 with a romance novel titled Miss Betty, and then in 1902 with a mystery novel titled The Mystery of the Sea. The Jewel of 7 Stars, which forms the basis of Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, was published next in 1903. This work is heavily inspired by the cultural obsession with Egyptology that ran through the bulk of the 19th century, an obsession so intense that it is often referred to as Egyptomania. The Western fascination with ancient Egypt can be traced back to the Napoleonic invasion of the country, which began in 1798. A year later, the Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French officer, giving the key to translating previously undecipherable hieroglyphics. Following the defeat of Napoleon by the British, the stone was captured, and under the 1801 Treaty of Alexandria, it became, quote-unquote, British property, and was shipped to the British Museum, where it has remained since 1802. From this point on, Egyptomania gripped the West, with explorations and excavations revealing the Temple of Abu Simbel in 1813, the life-size sarcophagus of Pharaoh Seti I in 1817, and the 36-foot-tall statue of Ramses II, discovered, albeit broken into pieces, in 1820. These discoveries captured the public imagination, and, not unexpectedly, also the imagination of many writers, appealing as they did to romantic interests in the ruins of the past. The first English-language story to feature a reanimated mummy was a 3-volume novel written in 1827 titled The Mummy! A Tale of the 22nd Century. This was written by Jane C. Loudon, although she was called Jane Webb at the time, and she was an early pioneer of science fiction, writing long before the term science fiction was actually ever coined. Initially published anonymously, it tells the story of the Egyptian mummy Cheops, who was revived in the year 2126. More importantly, the book depicts, as the author put it, quote, the state of improvement to which this country might possibly arrive, end quote. These improvements include England as a peaceful and Catholic country under the rule of Queen Claudia, ladies wearing trousers with hair ornaments of controlled flame, surgeons and lawyers as steam-powered automatons, and travel by air balloon being a common method of transportation. More speculative fiction than horror, The reanimated mummy is far more of a wise counsellor than monster, giving advice on life and politics to those whom he befriends. In 1840, the French writer Theodore Gautier gave us his story, The Mummy's Foot, in which a man buys a mummified foot in an antique shop, which is said to be the foot of an ancient Egyptian princess. That night he has a vision of the princess and offers to return her foot in exchange for a small statue, something he discovers has taken place when he wakes up. 5 years later, Edgar Allan Poe satirized Egyptomania with his short story, Some Words with a Mummy, while also taking a few shots at the Western belief in progress, something that he believed to be a fallacy. In this story, a mummy is subjected to electrical currents and awakes, but, much like Jane Webb's creation, engages in conversation about civilization and the inventions of the last centuries. Poe's worldview can probably be best summed up in a line from the story. Quote, "As for progress, it was at one time a nuisance, but it never progressed." End quote. So far, all very much in the realm of fantasy and satire, and it wouldn't really be until the 1860s that we would see the beginnings of mummy horror literature with which we are probably now more familiar. For many years, Louisa May Alcott, the writer of Little Women, was considered to be the first author to introduce the idea of a mummy's curse. This was with her 1869 story, Lost in a Pyramid, but it appears that she was beaten to the punch, with a story titled The Mummy's Soul, which was published by an anonymous writer in 1862, and another story titled After 3,000 Years, written by Jane G. Austen, not to be confused with the author of Pride and Prejudice, and which was published in 1868. All three of these stories feature a female mummy seeking revenge on those who have desecrated her tomb, and many modern critics have proposed these to be proto-feminist stories that establish an analogy between the desecration of tombs and also rape. And given that the 1800s saw the emergence of the quote-unquote New Woman feminist movement, a movement of which Louisa May Alcott was certainly a member, I would agree that these proposals are probably very correct, though more on that a little bit later. And then, at the end of the 1890s, Bram Stoker's friend, Arthur Conan Doyle, published two Egyptomania stories. The first was in 1890, with his story, The Ring of Thoth. The narrator of this, a character called Mr. John Vansittart Smith, is an English Egyptologist who recounts a story of the search for the elixir of life. This is a cautionary tale about the danger of obsession with knowledge and the limitations of modern intellect when compared with the wisdom of the past. It is a blend of both humour and supernatural elements, and probably can't really be considered horror, though the same could not be said of his follow-up, the story Lot Number 249, which was published in 1892. This story was dramatised in the 1990 film version of Tales from the Darkside, a highly enjoyable anthology movie featuring Christian Slater and very early roles for Steve Buscemi and Julianne Moore. More recently, it was dramatised by Mark Gatiss, yes, him again, for the BBC's Ghost Story for Christmas series, a 30-minute drama featuring Kit Harington and Freddie Fox. I would highly recommend both adaptations, which tell of a university student who reanimates a mummy to carry out revenge on those he believes have wronged him. The BBC version is far more faithful to the original story, but Tales from the Darkside the movie is a fantastic slice of 1990s horror, with three very good stories, particularly the final one, a fantastic cast, and a wraparound framing device featuring Debbie Harry from Blondie as a cannibalistic witch. In 1897, the English author Maria Corelli published her novel Ziska, The Problem of a Wicked Soul, and it is probably the first Egyptomania story to introduce the idea of reincarnation. This is something that we see in both the Jewel of Seven Stars, but also in many subsequent mummy movies, including 1932's The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, the Hammer 1959 reboot, starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and 2001's Universal comedy adventure blockbuster The Mummy Returns, starring Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, and Arnold Vosloo. In the same year, the British writer Richard Marsh published his Gothic horror novel, The Beetle, sometimes known as The Beetle, a Mystery. This tells of a shape-shifting ancient Egyptian entity seeking revenge on a British Member of Parliament, and you can insert your own jokes here. An incredibly popular book on publication, it initially sold 6 times more copies than Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published in the same year. This was followed in 1898 with the serialised publication of a novel called Pharaoh the Egyptian, written by Guy Boothby. This tells of a wizard cursed by the Egyptian gods for blasphemy, and who lives on eternally seeking their forgiveness. Eventually, he brings the plagues of Egypt upon a modern-day Europe, and this is a device that was also employed by Universal in their 1999 reboot of the Mummy franchise. All of which then brings us up to 1903, and the initial publication of Bram Stoker's The Jewel of Seven Stars, the source material for Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. And now we are at the point of the episode where we get into spoilers for both Bram Stoker's novel and also the film. So, as always, if you don't want to have the plot lines ruined for you, it's time to hit pause and then come back later. The novel is the first-person narration of a man called Malcolm Ross, a young barrister who is called for in the middle of the night. This is at the request of Margaret Trelawney, a young woman with whom he is rather smitten. Margaret is the daughter of Abel Trelawney, a famous archaeologist who has been found unconscious and bloody on the floor of his bedroom. Seemingly anticipating that something like this was going to happen, Trelawney has left a letter with explicit instructions that his body should not be disturbed and that he should be watched at all times until he wakes up. As an Egyptologist, his room is also filled with ancient artifacts, including a mummified cat, an item that will become important later. Malcolm agrees to keep watch over Trelawney, but he falls asleep, and there is a repeat of the incident the following night. The night after this, a stranger by the name of Corbeck arrives at the house. He is a fellow explorer and also a former colleague of Trelawney's, and reveals that many years prior, the two had discovered the tomb of a mysterious Egyptian queen named Terra. We learn that Terra was a being of great magical abilities, with the power to compel the gods of the upper and underworld. She also had the power over sleep and will, and we are also informed, quote, her body could become astral at command, and so move particle by particle, and become whole again when and where required. End quote. Within the tomb, they also discover a severed hand with 7 fingers and a star-shaped ruby, the Jewel of 7 Stars, and the means by which Queen Terra commands the gods. While Trelawney and Corbeck were investigating the tomb, they fell under a trance that lasted for 3 days, during which time Trelawney's wife died as she gave birth to their daughter Margaret. As the story progresses, it becomes apparent that Margaret, now 16 years old, seems to have knowledge of Terra's thoughts and feelings, and that the two are deeply connected. And indeed, over the course of the narrative, Margaret's personality begins to change, shifting from subservient and timid to someone far more confident and controlling. Trelawney recovers and reveals that the spirit of Queen Terra resides in the mummified cat, and that the attacks on him were the spirit's attempts to gain possession of the Jewel of 7 Stars, which he has kept in his safe and which is essential for her resurrection. The other essential elements are 7 lamps, which, when placed in the proper formation, will release a form of magic that will revive the mummified cat and also bring Tara's spirit to life. He proposes to hold the ritual to resurrect the Egyptian queen, and the characters leave London for a house in Cornwall that he has prepared for the occasion. Malcolm is quite understandably overwhelmed by all of this information and expresses a concern which addresses the central theme of the novel. This is that the wisdom of ancient civilizations will be proven to be very real, overwhelming the modern world, destroying Christian belief systems, and threatening what we consider reality with the true power of the ancients. Now, to be honest, in my opinion, Stoker's book does tend to be a little bit overwritten, so I have summarised Malcolm's words surrounding his fears as follows. If there were truth at all in the beliefs of ancient Egypt, then their gods had real existence, real power, real force. If then the old gods held their forces, where was the supremacy of the new? Of course, if the old gods had lost their power, or if they never had any, the experiment could not succeed. But if it should indeed succeed, or if there were a possibility of success, then we should be face to face with an influence so overwhelming that one hardly dare follow it to its conclusion. Was there room in the universe for opposing gods? The experiment does go ahead, and in the first edition of the novel it is a success, or at least it is implied that this is the case. Very ambiguous in its outcome, the implication is that Queen Tara is resurrected and is set free upon the world, though this is, as I say, implied rather than stated outright. Aside from Malcolm, the other characters, including Margaret, all perish. As a former member of the Historical Society in Dublin, Stoker had of course been long interested in Egyptology, and this is something that would only have been enhanced by the stories told by Sir William Wilde. So it's no surprise at all that he would write something within the emerging mummy subgenre. Many have commented on the attention to detail that he places on the description of Egyptian antiquities and of the mythology of the story, most of which, by all accounts, is presented with a great deal of accuracy. Unfortunately, though, on publication, the book was not very well received, particularly the ambiguous and very downbeat ending. When Stoker tried to republish in 1912, his publishers told him that he had to change the ending altogether. In the new ending, the experiment fails altogether, and Margaret then marries Malcolm, at which point one assumes they all lived happily ever after. Written at the turn of the century, many retrospective critics have picked up on the thematic anxieties about the conflict between the old world and the new, which would certainly have been prevalent as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. But they have also highlighted that Stoker's work also addresses the theme of the quote-unquote new woman, a movement that was beginning to emerge at the time that he wrote the novel. The new woman, as I briefly mentioned earlier, was a term given to a feminist movement that sought social and sexual freedom and which also challenged cultural and societal norms. Advocating for education, the right to vote, economic independence and social freedom, the movement is represented in the novel not by Margaret, but by the ancient Queen Tara. Margaret may begin the story as timid and rather weak, but as the narrative progresses and she falls more and more under the influence of the Queen, she becomes stronger and far more assertive, something that the male characters begin to view with a certain degree of anxiety. Although in the original ending Margaret dies, the implication is that Tara survives, suggesting a transformation of what was considered traditional femininity into a powerful force. All of this, though, is of course completely undone by the new ending, in which Margaret succumbs to a life of domesticity with Malcolm, and the ancient worlds are no longer a threat after all, which is at once incredibly anticlimactic, and also renders the whole novel, if we're honest, rather pointless. If you've watched Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, you will recognise that while Hammer kept the core of Stoker's story in their adaptation, a fair amount was also changed. Rather than centering on a solicitor called Malcolm, the central character of the movie is now Margaret, played by Valerie Leon, and the action begins not with her father's collapse, but the day prior, when he gifts her a ring, the Jewel of 7 Stars. Corbeck is still a former colleague of her father's, but in the film, and as played by James Villers, he is very much a villain, and unlike in the novel, Margaret's possession here makes her a figure of evil, killing her father's former colleagues, her doctor, and her boyfriend Todd, with gay abandon. There is, rather fortunately in my opinion, no mummified cat, and the 7 lamps required for resurrection have been replaced by various ceremonial items: a cat statue, the skull of a jackal, a figure of a snake, the Queen's severed hand, and the Scroll of Life. The first version of the screenplay was written by Christopher Wicking, who had already written the screenplays for the films Scream and Scream Again and Cry of the Banshee, which were both released in 1970. He also wrote additional dialogue for the film The Oblong Box, which was released in 1969. Hired by Hammer once the project was given the green light, according to the producer Howard Brandy, the version he submitted was virtually unusable. It was apparently too short, and Brandy went on to say that Wicking refused to do any rewrites. Wicking, for his part, claimed that the issue was less about his screenplay and more to do with a quarrel between Brandy and his own agent, and that he was effectively barred from the set. Whatever the truth, the script would end up being extensively rewritten by the man brought in to direct the film. Ironically enough, a man that was brought in at Wicking's own suggestion. Seth Holt was born in Palestine in 1923, but was educated in London. He originally trained as an actor, first at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in 1940, before moving into repertory companies in Liverpool and Devon. In 1943, he began working as an editing assistant at Ealing Studios, the company that we discussed back in episode 29. In this capacity, he worked on the classic horror anthology Dead of Night in 1945, as well as the comedies Kind Hearts and Coronets and Passport to Pimlico, both released in 1949. Promoted to editor, he served in this capacity for 4 years before becoming a producer on films including 1955's The Lady Killers, a film which some of you may remember I highly recommend. In 1958, he moved into directing with Ealing Studios' penultimate film, titled Nowhere to Go, a movie that he called, quote-unquote, the least Ealing film ever made. The head of Ealing Studios, Michael Balkan, later said that the film, quote, went wrong in treatment. It was pretentious. But was it worth doing? Of course. It gave a young director, Seth Holt, his first chance. And that's always on the credit side. End quote. After this, he returned to editing, including the 1960 British kitchen sink drama Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and The Entertainer, which starred Laurence Olivier, and which was released in the same year. He also directed episodes of the TV series Danger Man for its initial run, which was broadcast in 1960 and 1961. His second feature as a director was for Hammer Studios with their 1961 psychological thriller A Taste of Fear, which was released in the US as Scream of Fear. This film was the beginning of a series of psychodramas inspired in part by the French movie Les Diaboliques and in part by the success of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. This one tells the story of a wheelchair-bound heiress who travels to stay with her estranged father, only to discover that he has mysteriously been called away on business. Left with her incredibly suspect stepmother, she soon falls prey to a series of rather frightening events and begins to suspect some form of conspiracy. Featuring Christopher Lee, Susan Strasberg, and Anne Todd, it is not only the first of Hammer's psychological thriller series, but is also, in my opinion, probably the best. It's not up to the level of its filming inspirations, but it is highly enjoyable nonetheless. Holt followed this with the drama Station 6 Sahara, which starred Hollywood actress Carol Baker and was released in 1963. He then returned to Hammer to make The Nanny in 1965, another psychological horror thriller starring Bette Davis, Wendy Craig, Jill Bennett and James Villers. Again, it is one of the better of the Hammer psychological thrillers and tells the story of a young boy blamed for the drowning death of his younger sister. He begins to become incredibly suspicious of the family's long-term nanny, who is played with great gusto by Bette Davis. It was a huge success and received very good reviews. However, Bette Davis was, it's fair to say, not particularly enamoured with Seth Holt as a director, later calling him, quote, the most ruthless director I've ever worked with outside of William Wyler, end quote. Following this, he was attached to several projects that either failed to come to fruition or were abandoned. These included Danger Diabolique, which was eventually directed by Mario Bava, and a screenplay called Crusaders, which would eventually be developed into the cult movie If, directed by Lindsay Anderson. Brought in by Hammer to direct Blood from the Mummy's Tomb on Wicking's suggestion, according to the writer, quote, he was the only British director who I felt took the whole thing seriously. Seth understood the idea of a particular form of English madness and took the idea of this genre very seriously. He was an intelligent man, but not an intellectual, and he questioned everything. I knew he wouldn't just turn up and shoot the script. End quote. And, as it turns out, Wicking was right. Holt did a lot more than not just shoot the script, he dramatically rewrote it. According to Little Shop of Horrors magazine, Wicking's first draft had significant amounts of sex and nudity, including a black magic orgy that ended up with the character of Margaret having sex with her quote-unquote slave, the evil Corbeck. Needless to say, this is one of the scenes that was cut during the rewrites. With the script now rewritten and the director in place, casting began in earnest. Hammer star Peter Cushing was selected for the role of Margaret's Egyptian explorer father, whose name has, for some reason, been changed to Professor Fuchs. As well as Cushing, the cast also includes James Villers, who had worked with Seth Holt on The Nanny, Rosalie Crutchley, who had appeared as Mrs. Dudley in the 1963 film version of The Haunting, British character actor George Coulouris, and making his feature film debut, Australian actor Mark Edwards. For the dual role of Margaret and Queen Tara, director Holt and producer Brandy wanted an actress called Deborah Grant, a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company who would go on to appear in multiple British TV series over the course of her career. But head of Hammer James Carreras had a very different idea as to who should play the admittedly very challenging double role. His vision was somebody who possibly fit more into the Hammer glamour mould, a screen presence more in line with the likes of Ingrid Pitt, Caroline Munro, Kate O'Mara and Stephanie Beacham, all of whom were working with the studio during the early 1970s. For him, the perfect choice was an actress called Valerie Leon, who, at the time, was most famous for appearing in TV adverts for Hai Karate. This was a particularly noxious men's aftershave that was, according to the adverts at least, designed to drive women wild. I will link one of the commercials in the show notes, but you only have to see the finished movie to really get an understanding of the qualities that attracted Carreras' attention. Despite her advertising persona, Leon was, by her own accounts, a very shy person at the time, and neither Holt nor Brandy thought she was up to the part. But Carreras, quite rightly as it turned out, thought that she had star quality, and allegedly told them, quote, "You guys are the movie geniuses here, You make her an actress." End quote. Whether they fully succeeded or not, I will leave up to you. But to be fair to Leon, the role of Margaret is a highly complex one, requiring shifts in persona that would be challenging for even the most experienced performer. And while personally I am not convinced that she fully pulls it off, there is no denying that she is an incredible screen presence. She has a look that is reminiscent of Italian actress Edwige Fenech, and a star quality that radiates off the screen and pretty much carries the movie. It is also rather hard to judge her performance objectively, as, much like many other actors who worked for Hammer at the time, they made the somewhat bizarre decision to read up her dialogue in post-production. This was a task which fell to frequent voiceover actress Olive Gregg, who had also, somewhat strangely, dubbed for Martin Stevens in the 1960 sci-fi horror Village of the Damned. Quite why Hammer deemed this necessary is something of a mystery. In interviews, we can quite clearly hear that Leon's speaking voice is more than adequate for the part. But dubbing is something that the studio did quite often, including actor Leon Green in The Devil Rides Out, Ingrid Pitt in Countess Dracula, and Madeline and Mary Collinson in Twins of Evil. So, given this information, it's pretty impossible to fairly assess the overall quality of Leon's delivery. She also had a body double for the nude scenes, and, very strangely, a double for the scenes in which Margaret is running through the countryside. Assuming that Leon was capable of running, this decision makes very little sense unless it provided the economically minded studio the opportunity to film B-roll while also shooting their lead actress at the same time. Given the rise of the feminist movement at the beginning of the 1970s, one might have hoped that the movie would build on the theme of New Woman from Stoker's novel, but this subtext is nowhere to be seen in the final product, and this is something that feels very much a missed opportunity. Unlike the Margaret of the novel, the film version is quite clearly already independent, making the momentary transitions into Queen Tara less a study in female dynamics and more one of absolute horror. Not that there is anything wrong with that, but I do think they could have maintained both. To be fair though, this may have been more due to the casting of Leon, who strikes a far more imposing figure than original choice Deborah Grant, who, on reflection, may have been able to offer a greater degree of contrast. Through the opening ritual and a very effective use of voiceover, we quickly establish that Queen Tara is a figure of great power. We are told via callback that she was a queen of darkness, and in a nod to Nietzschean philosophy that she exists beyond good and evil. Even then though, we know very little about her powers and the actual threat that she poses to the world when compared to the philosophy in Stoker's original story. Whether this is a flaw in the original screenplay, or Holt's continual rewrites during shooting, or complexities in the filming and editing process, all remains a little bit unclear. I say this because, very unfortunately, the film had an incredibly troubled production history. After only one day of shooting, Peter Cushing left the production, as his beloved wife Helen was terminally ill, and suffering from the condition emphysema, she died just a few days later. Valerie Leon has recalled that on his one day on set, they filmed the moment where Margaret is gifted the ring by her father, and she has also gone on to say she was greatly saddened, both by his wife's death and the opportunity that they weren't able to continue working together. Cushing was replaced at very short notice by the actor Andrew Keir, who had already worked with Hammer on the films Dracula Prince of Darkness in 1965 and Quatermass and the Pit in 1967. There is no doubt at all that Keir was a fine actor, and he does a very good job in the movie despite next to no preparation time. But I suspect that Cushing, who was nothing if not thorough in planning his characterization, would have brought far more depth to the role than the somewhat confusing ambiguity we have in the final film. In the novel, it is made quite explicit that the professor is willing to risk everything for science, saying to the narrator Malcolm, quote, "What is a woman's life in the scale with what we hope for?" End quote. In the film, however, his motivations are rather unclear. He is certainly obsessed, possibly part possessed, with the will of the Egyptian queen, but the fact that he is putting his daughter's life in danger is never really adequately addressed. There is certainly a subtext that alludes to a sexual obsession as much as a scientific one. This is a man who has dedicated his life to a dead woman who looks exactly like his adult daughter, and this is very uncomfortable, nudging towards themes of necrophilia and incest that the film raises but then leaves somewhat hanging. In the novel, Trelawney is attacked by the spirit of terror as she tries to obtain her sacred ruby, whereas in the film version, it is implied that the attack comes after he attempts to do something with the body he has kept for years in his basement. This is also emphasised by a moment in the closing sequence of the film, where Margaret, possessed by terror as the ritual begins, strokes her father's face and neck in a manner that is far from daughterly. These are intriguing moments, and one suspects that Cushing would have made much more of them, giving a deeper rationale to a character who, to all intents and purposes, is willing to put his own daughter's life at risk. The motivations of the other male characters in the film are, however, far more clear-cut. Corbeck, who is played marvellously by James Villers, seeks to harness terror's power for himself, rather foolishly believing that he is the dominant party. It is he who refers to the Queen in Nietzschean terms, shortly before delivering the marvellous line, "The meek won't inherit the earth, they wouldn't know what to do with it." Villiers had already worked with Seth Holt on The Nanny, and he delivers what is one in a long line of suave upper-class villains that he would play for the majority of his acting career. Corbeck here is a fantastic character, though there are those who worked on the set who would argue that this was less a performance and more just Villiers playing himself. Rod Barron, who was the clapper loader on the movie, has been quoted as saying, quote, "Although most actors are completely different from the characters they play, with James, he was what you saw on the screen. I remember sitting, watching him, and thinking, how nice it must be to earn so much money for just being yourself. Though he did do it very well." End quote. And if you want to see him playing himself very well in other movies, he provides a memorable turn as the upper-class brother to Charlotte Rampling in 1972's anthology movie Asylum, and an upper-class villain in the wonderful, but sadly little-known children's movie The Amazing Mr. Blunden, which was also released in 1972. Vying for Margaret's attention, and possibly her soul, is her boyfriend Todd Browning, named after the director of the Universal Dracula in one of a small handful of Easter eggs contained in the film. If you look closely, the estate agent sign outside the house in which Corbeck is hiding bears the legend Neame and Skeggs, named after the Hammer producers Christopher Neame and Roy Skeggs. Todd's ambitions are to use the secrets of terror for the good of humanity, believing that her knowledge of suspended animation can serve as a cure for diseases like cancer. And while he may certainly have noble intentions, I would argue that he is possibly just as much of a user as Corbeck. When Margaret jokes near the beginning of the film that he only wants her for two things, this is probably closer to the truth than she would care to admit. His fascination with her father's expedition seems to be as much a motivation for their relationship as anything else, and his resorting to physical violence when Margaret refuses to give up the experiment is hardly the act of a noble hero. Interestingly enough, though, the film and Terror decide to kill him off at the midway point, a rather unusual act for films of this period, and while I won't say he completely deserves it, it's not necessarily a shame to see him go. The manner of Todd's death in a car accident is filmed very strangely, a series of almost still images which, put together, create an almost stop-motion effect. Whether this is a vision seen by Margaret or an absolute depiction of reality is very unclear, and this rather clumsy sequence is sadly something which stems from another tragedy that befell the film. During the 4th week of shooting, director Seth Holt died from a heart attack at the age of just 47. A director who worked with internal vision as opposed to filming notes, the incomplete footage that he left behind came with no clear instructions as to how he had planned to assemble it during the editing process. That he had a plan at all is evident by comments he made to Howard Brandy, who questioned him on how he planned to assemble everything that he'd filmed. "Don't worry," he is reported to have told him, "I know what I'm going to do with that. I can't wait to get my hands on it in the editing room." Tragically, he never had the chance. The filming was continued under the guidance of Michael Carreras, the son of the studio head James, and who by this time was the managing director of Hammer. And to be fair to Carreras, he did an admirable job under very hard conditions, finishing the final week of shooting and then working with the editors to pull the film together. But this is one of the many reasons why the film feels so disjointed, not only with Todd's death, but also the confusing scenes where Margaret terrorizes Helen the fortune teller, then runs off through the woods, then appears back at the house, with no real logic for why she does either. With all of these comments, you would be forgiven for assuming that I'm not a fan of the film, and this of course is not the case. I wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't enjoy it. The story itself is a fascinating one, and the presence of Valerie Leon and the performance of James Villers are both highly enjoyable. The references to Nietzsche and the allusions to sexual obsession are incredibly intriguing, if not fully thought out, and with the additional references to the stars being aligned and the return of ancient beings, the film ultimately nudges closer to cosmic horror than it does a conventional mummy movie. But more than anything else, much like so much of Hammer's output, the film is visually sumptuous. The initial exploration of Tara's tomb, lit by torches, is very well done, and the scenes of Margaret entering the cellar in a trance state as the open furnace blazes behind her is a moment of great beauty that has entered into 1970s horror iconography. The sequence where Todd searches for his friend Dandridge, played by Hugh Burden, outside his offices is also beautifully executed. The studio set is haunted by wisps of blue fog as the shadow of a jackal appears on the wall behind him. Similarly, the scenes in the asylum, with its incredibly repugnant orderlies, are also very well handled, even if, as more than one person has mentioned, it feels more out of the Victorian era than the 1970s attitude towards mental health. The scenes in the asylum all lead, of course, to the death of Berrigan, a brilliantly effective sequence of fast cuts and extreme close-ups that was the work of Michael Carreras after he took over the movie. Finally, there is the ending, which preserves the ambiguity of Stoker's novel while also being remarkably downbeat and cynical. We are told that all but one occupant of the house perished in the climactic moments, and then we are shown a woman, bandaged from head to foot in a hospital bed. Here, at last, we are given the mummy that most cinema goers would have been expecting, though this one still very much subverts our expectations. Many people believe that this figure is Margaret, but given that we are told she was found naked, it seems far more likely that Tara, who we have assumed to be stabbed to death, lies beneath the gauzes. We never learn which one of them it is, and I will leave it to you to decide for yourself whether goodness or evil have triumphed, but I know which side of the fence I'm sitting on. On its release in 1971, the film premiered at the National Film Theatre in London, where Hammer was being honoured with their first retrospective, a moment that James Carreras stated was a sign of the studio finally being recognised. The monthly film bulletin was impressed overall with the final film, and while it noted the unresolved plot threads I've already mentioned, it also felt that, quote, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is Holt's most distinctive work, and effortlessly the best of Hammer's recent attempts to develop the classic horror themes. The explanatory background that conventionally emerges in a few garbled words during or after the climax in a horror movie here becomes the substance of the whole first half of the film. A mythic, amoral deity is built up, and an entire attendant cosmogony suggested, through astrological references and other choice details. End quote. And while Variety called the film polished and well acted, but rather tame, the New York Times thought it was, quote, tremendous fun, skillful, and wonderfully energetic. End quote. For me personally, the film is, like much of Hammer's output of the period, a fascinating but flawed attempt to take horror into new directions. And given the incredibly troubled production, one can hardly be surprised if the end result feels fragmented. With glimpses of brilliance in between all the chaos, I am convinced that, had Seth Holt lived to finish the film, it would be lauded as one of the studio's last great movies, as opposed to the somewhat frustrating, but undeniably beautiful mosaic that it eventually became. Following the first edition publication of The Jewel of Seven Stars, Bram Stoker wrote 4 more novels: The Man in 1905, which was also known as The Gates of Life, Lady Atheline, which was published in 1908, The Lady of the Shroud, published in 1909, and The Lair of the White Worm, published in 1911. This was famously and very loosely adapted into a truly and typically bonkers film by the English director Ken Russell in 1988, and it's gone on to become a camp cult classic. If you've never seen it, it's probably worth a watch, but be prepared. It is, as I say, absolutely bonkers. After suffering a series of strokes, Bram Stoker died in London on the 20th of April 1912. Some biographies attribute the cause of his death to overwork, while others to tertiary syphilis. He was cremated, and his ashes are contained in a display urn at Golders Green Crematorium in North London. 10 years after his death, an expedition led by the explorer Howard Carter and his patron, George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun. A series of deaths surrounding the expedition led many to believe that the tomb was cursed, though this is somewhat counterbalanced by the fact that Howard Carter, the man who actually opened the tomb, lived to the age of 64 and died 17 years after the discovery. But, as we've said before, the truth very seldom gets in the way of a good story. Interestingly enough, though, the first mummy film, or pseudo-mummy film, that I am aware of predates the discovery of Tutankhamun by 7 years, and I am extremely grateful to the Instagram account Whispers of Fear for highlighting this quite literally the day before recording. This was a Russian horror film called The Avenging Hand, and according to the Instagram account, the story tells of an archaeologist who discovers the tomb of an Egyptian queen. While attempting to recover an artifact, he mistakenly removes her hand and decides to keep it as a specimen, which all sounds a little bit familiar. Immediately, the ghost of the queen rises from her tomb and places a curse on the man, with her hand coming to life and tormenting the professor even on his return to England. Considered a half-lost film, only the first portion has been found and restored, and you can see a very brief clip of it on the Whispers of Fear Instagram account. In 1932, 10 years after the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened, and stories of the curse were sensationalized by the newspapers, Universal released their film The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, Edward Sloane, and Zita Johann. Excavations and explorations continue in Egypt to this day, though fortunately are now managed with more care and decorum than those of the 1800s. As recently as August 2022, archaeologists from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw announced the discovery of a 4,500-year-old temple dedicated to the Egyptian sun god Ra. Whether there are any curses surrounding the discovery seems incredibly unlikely, but I suppose that all remains to be seen. Eyes Without a Face and Blood from the Mummy's Tomb are both films that centre around fathers whose obsessions with science, and with their daughters, overtake rationality and draw them into horror. Neither figure is the traditional manic character that we might expect from a horror film, but are instead deeply flawed men whose attempts to complete their respective discoveries cause them to lose sight of morality and ultimately the welfare of their offspring. And while both are stylistically and narratively very different films, put together they provide a caustic perspective on traditional family dynamics and values, suggesting that when all is said and done, it is our humanity, or lack thereof, that is the ultimate threat to family stability. Ultimately, both films ask us to consider whether it is always our children's best interests we have at heart, or our own. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do consider sharing it with a horror-loving friend, and as always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or opinions on the films we've discussed this week, or any of the pairings that we've covered so far in the series, you can email thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow our Instagram account, The Horror Double Bill. And I have to say, I am incredibly excited about next week's episode, because not only are we covering our first zombie movie of the series, but it's also a film I've wanted to discuss ever since the podcast began. I just couldn't work out what movie to pair it with. Fortunately, inspiration struck, as it so often does, at 3 a.m. a couple of weeks ago, and so finally we're able to both watch it and discuss it. So first up, we have a Spanish-Italian co-production from 1974, which, in true Euro horror style, is known under multiple titles. Its most commonly known title is The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue. However, you might also find it under the names Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, The Living Dead, Breakfast at Manchester Morgue, or Don't Open the Window. This was directed by Jorge Grau and stars Ray Lovelock, Christina Galbo, and Arthur Kennedy. And we're following this with a far more recent film, which is When Evil Lurks from 2023. This is directed by Damien Rugner and stars Ezequiel Rodriguez, Damian Salomon, Sylvia Sabata, and Louis Zimbrowski. And just as a heads up, this film is fairly full on, so don't say I didn't warn you. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. You can currently find The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue under several of its many titles, streaming for free, although with adverts, on Tubi. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.